January 17, 1945, Luzon, Philippines. The air smelled of smoke and wet earth. In a foxhole carved into the volcanic soil of the Cagayan Valley, a young Japanese infantry soldier named Corporal Takeshi Yamada pressed his back against the muddy wall and closed his eyes. His uniform, once the proud khaki of the Imperial Army, hung in tatters. The rice ration that morning had been a handful, barely enough to coat his palm, and the grains had been mixed with weevils. He chewed them anyway. Protein was protein. Around him, the artillery thunder rolled like distant drums. American guns speaking in a language his commanders had promised would never reach this far. But here they were. And here he was, 23 years old, hollow-bellied, weighing perhaps 90 pounds. In his breast pocket, folded until the creases had worn thin, was a letter from his mother in Hiroshima. She had written about persimmons ripening in the fall, about his younger sister learning to sew, about honor and duty and the ancestors watching from the clouds. He had read it so many times the ink had smudged. He wondered if he would ever taste a persimmon again. He wondered if honor tasted like anything at all when your stomach folded in on itself. Yamada had been told over and over, through training and indoctrination, and the cold sermons of officers whose boots were only slightly less worn than his own, that the Americans were weak, soft, corrupted by luxury and decadence, slaves to material comfort, cowards who could not endure hardship. The Japanese soldier was forged in discipline, tempered by scarcity, spiritually superior. Yamada had believed this once, back when belief was easy, back when the war was still something that happened in newspaper headlines and propaganda films. Now, crouched in the mud with his stomach gnawing at itself, he believed in nothing except the next breath, the next step, the next daybreak. He did not yet know that within 6 weeks he would surrender. He did not yet know that surrender, which his commanders had told him was a fate worse than death, would deliver him not into the hands of demons, but into a world so alien, so impossibly abundant, that it would shatter every doctrine he had ever been taught. He did not yet know about the ice cream, to understand what happened to men like Yamada, and to the tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers who became prisoners of war in American hands during the final years of the Pacific War. We must first understand what they were fleeing from, and what they had been taught to expect. The Japanese military culture of World War II was built upon a foundation of Bushido, the way of the warrior, reinterpreted through the lens of 20th century ultranationalism. The code was ancient, but its modern application was ruthless. Surrender was unthinkable. The 1941 Imperial Army Field Manual stated explicitly, "Do not suffer the shame of being taken alive." Soldiers were expected to fight to the death or take their own lives. Capture was not merely defeat. It was moral annihilation, the erasure of family honor, a stain that could never be washed away. This was not an empty threat. Japanese soldiers who surrendered were considered dead by their own government. Their names were struck from family registers. Families were told their sons had been killed in action, because to the Imperial command they had. The living ghost of a POW was worse than a corpse. At least a corpse could be honored, and so Japanese soldiers were taught that the enemy would torture them, mutilate them, parade them through streets as subhuman trophies. American and Allied forces, they were told, were barbaric, racially inferior, incapable of mercy. Better to die with a grenade in hand than fall into such darkness. This belief was so deeply embedded that in the early years of the Pacific War, Japanese soldiers almost never surrendered. On Attu Island in 1943, out of a garrison of 2,500 men, only 28 were taken alive, and most of those were too badly wounded to resist. On Saipan in 1944, thousands of Japanese civilians and soldiers chose suicide, leaping from cliffs, detonating grenades rather than face what they imagined would be an American hell. But by 1945, the calculus was shifting. Japan was losing. The supply lines were severed. The soldiers on distant islands and jungle battlefields were starving. Malaria, dysentery, and beriberi killed as many men as bullets. Officers hoarded the remaining food. Cannibalism, once unthinkable, occurred in desperate pockets of the New Guinea and Philippine campaigns. Men who had been told they were the spiritual elite of Asia were reduced to digging roots from the ground and boiling leather for sustenance. And in that extremity, some chose life. Some chose surrender. What they found on the other side was a revelation that no propaganda had prepared them for. The first shock was survival itself. Corporal Yamada, captured in late February 1945 after his unit was overrun near the town of Bambang, had expected a bullet to the head. Instead, he was given water. Not a trickle, not a sip rationed from a canteen, but a full canteen pressed into his hands by a young American private who spoke no Japanese but gestured for him to drink. Yamada drank, and his body, so long deprived, shuddered with the sudden mercy of it. He was searched, stripped of his rifle and his sword, symbols of his identity, and then marched under guard to a holding area. He expected violence. He expected humiliation. What he received was a blanket, a medical inspection, and a meal. The meal was not grand by American standards. It was a field ration, canned beef crackers, a small tin of fruit cocktail. But to Yamada, who had not eaten meat in 4 months, it was impossible. He ate slowly, mechanically, his mind unable to process the abundance. Around him, other Japanese prisoners sat in stunned silence, chewing, swallowing, staring at the ground as if the earth itself had betrayed them. One man wept. Not from relief, but from confusion. This pattern repeated itself across the Pacific theater. Japanese POWs delivered into American custody encountered a logistical machine that operated on principles entirely foreign to them. The United States military, even at the farthest reaches of its supply chain, maintained standards of nutrition and medical care that seemed obscene to men who had been eating grass. At the POW camp on Guam, established in mid-1944, Japanese prisoners were fed 3 meals a day, totaling approximately 3,000 calories. More than many of them had consumed in a week on the front lines. The menu included rice, yes, but also bread, canned vegetables, meat, and on certain days dessert. On Independence Day 1945, the prisoners at Guam were served cake. Cake. It was not an act of kindness. It was doctrine. The United States was a signatory to the Geneva Convention, and though Japan was not, American policy dictated that POWs would be treated according to international law. This was partly humanitarian principle, partly strategic calculation. Well-treated prisoners were more likely to cooperate, more likely to provide intelligence, less likely to incite unrest. And there was another reason, quieter but no less important. America wanted to prove something. To the prisoners, to the world, and perhaps to itself. It wanted to prove that democracy was not weakness, that abundance was not decadence, that a nation built on liberty and material prosperity could still produce warriors and could afford mercy. The ice cream came later, and it became the symbol that prisoners could not forget. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, at camps in California and Texas and Louisiana, Japanese POWs began to encounter aspects of American life that seemed less like wartime internment and more like a fever dream. They were housed in barracks with electric lights and heating. They received mail and could write letters home, though few did. Shame and disbelief kept their pens silent. They were given work assignments, usually agricultural labor, and paid a small wage under Geneva Convention rules. And they were introduced to recreation. At the POW camp in Trinidad, Colorado, Japanese prisoners were given access to a baseball field. Baseball, ironically, was a sport they knew well. It had been popular in Japan since the early 20th century. But baseball in captivity, baseball played on American soil with American equipment, supervised by American guards who sometimes joined the games, was something else entirely. It was normalcy weaponized. It was a demonstration that even in imprisonment, even in defeat, life did not have to be suffering. Some prisoners embraced it. They played with the intensity of men starved for purpose. Others stood at the sidelines, watching in silence, trying to reconcile this reality with everything they had been taught. And then there was the ice cream, at several camps, including the large facilities at Camp Livingston in Louisiana and Camp Shelby in Mississippi. Prisoners were served ice cream during the hot summer months, not as a rare treat but regularly, as part of the standard meal rotation. Vanilla, chocolate, sometimes strawberry, served in metal bowls eaten with wooden spoons. To understand what this meant, we must pause and consider the context. In Japan during the war, sugar was rationed to near extinction. Milk was scarce. Ice cream was a luxury that had disappeared from civilian life entirely by 1943. Japanese soldiers in the field had not tasted anything sweet in years. Their idea of dessert was a rice ball pressed with plum if they were lucky. And here in American POW camps, ice cream was routine. One prisoner, a former school teacher named Hiroshi Tanaka, later wrote in his memoir about the first time he was served ice cream. He described holding the bowl, staring at the pale swirl of vanilla, watching it begin to melt in the Louisiana heat. He wrote that he did not eat it at first. He simply held it, feeling the cold seep into his palms, thinking about his daughters back in Kyoto, wondering if they remembered what sweetness tasted like. When he finally ate, he wrote, he understood that the war was lost, not because Japan had been defeated on the battlefield, he had known that for months, but because the Americans could afford to give ice cream to their enemies. That level of abundance, that casual generosity, was the product of a system he had been taught to despise, and yet here it was, undeniable, melting on his tongue. He wrote, I realized then that we had been fighting a country we did not understand. We called them weak, but weakness does not produce ice cream in the jungle. We called them soft, but soft men do not cross an ocean to bring war to our shores. We were told they had no spirit, but I tasted their spirit in that ice cream. It was the spirit of a nation that believed it could afford to be kind. The transformation was not universal, and it was not simple. Many Japanese POWs remained trapped in the ideology that had brought them to war. They believed the kindness was a trick, a psychological weapon designed to break their will. They clung to the hope that Japan would achieve a miraculous reversal, that the emperor would rally the nation to victory, that their suffering would be redeemed. These men isolated themselves within the camps, forming tight cliques of die-hard loyalists who harassed and sometimes attacked those who accepted American hospitality. At Camp McCoy, tensions between hardline prisoners and those who cooperated with camp authorities became so severe that the U.S. command was forced to segregate the camps, creating separate compounds for the irreconcilables. Even there, the hardliners maintained discipline. They conducted morning exercises, recited oaths of loyalty, and punished perceived traitors with violence. In one documented incident, a prisoner who accepted work as a translator was beaten so badly he required hospitalization. But for many others, the dissonance was too great to ignore. They had been told that Americans were devils. They had been shown day after day that Americans were merely men. Men who could be cruel, yes, men who could be indifferent, but also men who distributed blankets and medicine and ice cream. Men who played baseball, men who laughed. One prisoner, speaking anonymously in a post-war interview, described the moment his belief system collapsed. It was not during a meal or a game. It was during a medical inspection. He had developed an infected wound on his leg, a common affliction in the jungle. In his unit, such wounds were often ignored until they became gangrenous, and then the leg was amputated, or the soldier was left to die. In the POW camp, an American medic cleaned the wound, applied sulfa powder, bandaged it carefully, and told him through a translator to return the next day for a fresh dressing. The prisoner said, "He touched me, not with hatred, not with disgust, just efficiently, as if I were a person. I had not been treated as a person in years, and I realized that my officers, the men I had obeyed without question, had cared less for my life than this enemy soldier did." This was the quiet revolution that occurred in the camps, not a political conversion, not an ideological awakening in the Western sense, but a slow, painful realization that the narrative they had been given was a lie. The war ended on August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. For Japanese POWs in American camps, the news arrived like a thunderclap. Some refused to believe it. The emperor, they insisted, would never surrender. It had to be American propaganda. Only when they were shown photographs of the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri did the reality begin to settle. For some, it was liberation. The war was over. They had survived. They would eventually go home. For others, it was the final collapse. If the emperor had surrendered, then their suffering had been for nothing. The comrades who had died, the years of starvation and disease, the shame of capture, all of it meaningless. Some prisoners attempted suicide even after the surrender was confirmed. Others withdrew into catatonic silence. But there were also those who chose to look forward. In the months after the war, as the repatriation process began, many Japanese POWs were given one last opportunity to witness American abundance. They were transported on ships back across the Pacific, and on those ships they were fed the same rations as American servicemen. 3 meals a day, meat, bread, coffee, and yes, on some ships, ice cream. One prisoner, a farmer from Hokkaido named Kenji Sato, later described standing on the deck of a transport ship, watching the California coast appear on the horizon. He had never been to America before his capture, and he would never return after his repatriation. But in that moment, he said, he understood what his country had been fighting. "We thought we were fighting soldiers," he said. "We were fighting a factory that made ships and planes and ice cream. We could not defeat a factory." The baseball remained with them too. After the war, many former POWs who had played baseball in the camps returned to Japan and continued playing. Some joined amateur leagues. A few even played professionally in Japan's post-war baseball resurgence. They brought with them the habits they had learned in American camps, the emphasis on teamwork, the rituals of the dugout, the strange democracy of the game where every man, regardless of rank, had to wait his turn to bat. In interviews decades later, these men would sometimes speak of the camps not with bitterness, but with a kind of wistful confusion. They had been taught that captivity would strip them of their humanity. Instead, they found that it had given them something they had not known they lacked: a glimpse of a world where human life was not expendable, where abundance was not hoarded by elites, where even the defeated could eat and rest and play. This is not to romanticize the POW camps. Conditions varied widely. Some camps were brutal. Racism, casual and institutional, permeated the system. Japanese POWs were segregated from German and Italian prisoners, housed in harsher conditions, subjected to greater suspicion. The camps were still prisons. The men inside them were still trapped, still severed from their families, still bearing the unbearable weight of shame. But within that system, contradictions flourished. The same nation that incarcerated Japanese American citizens in camps on the West Coast fed Japanese soldiers ice cream in camps in the South. The same military that firebombed Tokyo and dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ensured that captured enemy soldiers received medical care and recreation. It was a paradox that Japanese prisoners could not easily process, because it did not fit into the binary worldview they had been given. Americans were supposed to be either strong or weak, either honorable or barbaric. They were not supposed to be both and neither, not supposed to be complex, not supposed to be human. But they were. In the years after the war, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, the stories of the POWs began to filter back into Japanese society. They were not celebrated. Many former prisoners never spoke of their experiences, carrying the shame of surrender to their graves. Families did not ask, and the men did not tell. But the stories existed, whispered in veteran circles, recorded in obscure memoirs, preserved in the memories of men who had tasted ice cream in Louisiana and played baseball in Colorado and learned that the enemy was not the monster they had imagined. And slowly, over decades, a shift occurred. The post-war generation of Japanese citizens grew up in a nation that had adopted, in modified form, many American institutions. Democracy, however imperfect, baseball wildly popular, consumer capitalism, embraced with fervor, ice cream, ubiquitous. The Japan that emerged from the ashes of 1945 was not the Japan that had marched into war. It was a nation that had learned, painfully and incompletely, that abundance and discipline were not opposites, that strength and kindness were not mutually exclusive, that the world was more complex than the propagandists had claimed. The men who had been prisoners played a small, quiet role in that transformation. They returned to their villages and cities carrying knowledge they could not fully articulate. They had seen the other side, not of battle but of ideology. They had lived briefly in a world where the defeated were fed and the hungry were given cake, and the captives were allowed to play a game in the sun. And though they could not always explain it, though shame and pride kept many of them silent, they knew something their commanders had never understood, that the war had been lost not on the beaches of Iwo Jima or in the skies over Tokyo, but long before in the calculus of nations, in the mathematics of resources, in the cold logic of a country that could send ice cream to its enemies because it had so much that even generosity was affordable. There is a photograph, archived in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, taken at Camp Shelby in the summer of 1945. It shows a group of Japanese POWs sitting in the shade of a barracks, eating from metal bowls. The photograph is black and white, grainy, the faces indistinct. But if you look closely, you can see that some of the men are smiling. Not broadly, not with joy, but with the faint, tentative expression of people who have been granted an unexpected reprieve. What they are eating is not visible in the frame. The photographer did not note it in the caption, but records from Camp Shelby indicate that ice cream was served that day, vanilla, distributed in the late afternoon to help the prisoners cope with the Mississippi heat. Those men, sitting in the shade eating ice cream, were the living refutation of everything they had been taught. They had not been tortured. They had not been paraded as animals. They had been fed, sheltered, allowed to rest. And in being treated as human, they were forced to reckon with the possibility that their enemies were human too. This was the quiet, devastating victory of the American POW system. Not the victory of arms, but the victory of logistics and ideology made manifest. It was the proof, undeniable and edible, that a society built on abundance and individual dignity could sustain itself even in war, could extend the benefits of that system even to those who had tried to destroy it. It was not mercy for mercy's sake. It was strategy, propaganda, doctrine, but it was also in its way a kind of grace. Corporal Takeshi Yamada returned to Japan in early 1946. He arrived at the port of Yokohama on a cold morning in February, 1 year after his capture. He had gained 30 pounds in American custody, enough weight that his mother, waiting on the dock, did not recognize him at first. When she did, she wept, though he never knew if it was from relief or shame. He did not speak much about his time as a prisoner. His family did not ask. In the rigid social hierarchy of post-war Japan, former POWs occupied an uncomfortable space, neither hero nor villain, simply erased. Yamada found work in a factory, married, had children. He lived a quiet life, unremarkable in every way except for the memories he carried. In 1982, in his 60s, he gave a single interview to a graduate student researching POW experiences. The interview was brief, uncomfortable. Yamada answered questions in short sentences, deflecting, guarding the old wound. But at the end, unprompted, he said something the student recorded in her notes. He said, "I remember the ice cream. I don't know why, but I remember it more than the battles, more than the hunger. I remember standing in line with the other men holding a bowl and thinking, this is what we were fighting. Not the soldiers, the ice cream." He paused, and then he said, "We could never have won." The ice cream, in the end, was not just dessert. It was a symbol, potent and strange, of the vast gulf between two nations, two systems, two worldviews. On one side, an empire that glorified sacrifice and scarcity, that told its soldiers to die rather than surrender, that hoarded resources for the elite while the common soldier starved. On the other, a republic that produced so much it could afford to be generous even to its enemies, that believed abundance was not a sin but a virtue, that turned logistics into a form of soft power. The Japanese soldiers who scoffed at American comfort, who believed that hardship made them superior, learned in the camps that comfort was not weakness. It was strength of a different kind, the strength of a system that could feed its people, heal its wounded, and still have enough left over to offer ice cream to prisoners of war. And in learning that, some of them, not all but some, began to see the war differently. Not as a noble struggle between East and West, spirit and materialism, but as a collision between two vastly unequal powers, one of which had been deceived by its own propaganda into thinking that willpower could overcome industrial capacity. It could not. The ice cream proved it. Today, in the archives and museums and fading memories of the Second World War, the story of Japanese POWs in American camps is a footnote, a curiosity. It does not fit neatly into the grand narratives of heroism and villainy that we prefer. It complicates the story. It shows us that even in total war, even in a conflict as brutal and racialized as the Pacific Theater, there were moments of strange grace, pockets of humanity, systems that functioned not out of cruelty, but out of a bureaucratic commitment to principle. The men who experienced those moments carried them in silence, locked away behind shame and pride and the unbridgeable distance between what they expected and what they found. But the truth persisted, quiet and undeniable. In the taste of vanilla on a hot summer day, in the crack of a bat against a ball, in the realization that the enemy was not a demon but a man, and that his nation, for all its flaws, had built something formidable not just in steel and fire but in the simple, astonishing ability to produce more than it needed. That was the lesson of the ice cream. That was the revelation of the camps. The war was not lost on the battlefield alone. It was lost in the arithmetic of abundance, in the cold calculus that measured calories and morale and the capacity to sustain not just an army, but a vision of the world where even the defeated could eat, and rest and perhaps in time understand. And so the ice cream melted, and the baseball games ended and the prisoners went home. But the memory remained, a small cold sweetness in the midst of ruin, a glimpse of a world they had been taught to despise and found themselves against all doctrine and belief, unable to forget. It was the taste of empire, yes, but also the taste of a different kind of power, one that did not demand death but offered life, one that measured victory not just in territory conquered but in the capacity to be generous even when generosity seemed undeserved. That was America's quiet triumph in those camps. Not just that it won the war, but that it won it in a way that made some of its enemies question everything they had been taught, and wonder, if only for a moment, if only in the privacy of memory, whether the world they had fought for was the world worth defending. The ice cream said no, and for some men, that was enough.